The novel begins with Calvinist Reverend Guyon and his wife Camilla taking sail to Europe on the Perdu Victory. During the voyage, Camilla is taken ill with appendicitis, and unfortunately for her, the ship's doctor is not a doctor. He is the elusive money forger, Mr. Sinistera. Although he does his best to save her life, he fails and Camilla dies. Sinistera is arrested, and the newly widowed Guyon is left to wander Spain with the body of his deceased wife in tow. Camilla is buried in the town of San Zwingli in the Catholic rite, and Guyon begins a period of literal and spiritual wandering. After some time spent in a monastery, illness overcomes Guyon, and he is awoken in the night by a spectral vision of Camilla. This marks the final time Guyon will ever see his dead love. Soon after this vision, he returns to America with a number of strange, un-Protestant items, including a Barbary ape named Heracles. At home waits his son, and the closest character the Recognitions has to a protagonist, Wyatt, and his puritanical Aunt May. It is clear to his family and his parishioners that Reverend Guyon is not the same man who left. He has become increasingly interested with obscure philosophy, theology, religion, and mysticism from around the world and throughout history, and he has become consumed with this to the neglect of the present. His only communication with Wyatt seems to be when he regales him with esoteric fables and when he encourages his doubts about the Christian worldview. Aunt May is appalled by this, and she only grows more apocalyptic in her Calvinism until her death. She chastises Wyatt over his sinful interest in art, to where he destroys any original drawing he creates. Given the lack of serious oversight from the adults in his life, Wyatt begins to make copies of the Bosch and Bruegel paintings his father has brought back from Europe. In an accidental act of symbolic violence, and in one of the most well-analysed analogies in the text, Wyatt kills a wren and is horrified by his own actions and is unable to take responsibility for the deed. As Guyon becomes more nonconformist in his thought, Wyatt is struck down by a terrible illness which modern medicine can't solve. Taking matters into his own hand, the Reverend sacrifices the Barbary ape in a pagan ritual, and Wyatt recovers. While Wyatt isn't aware that the ritual has taken place, a rift between father and son grows greater and greater. The years pass, and it becomes more clear that Wyatt's heart is not with the seminary, but with his art. He drops out of divinity school and travels to Europe to study painting. The letter his father receives describing this change of fortune is torn up and scattered into the wind. If I had to summarise what I thought was going on at the core of this first chapter of the Recognitions, beyond all the overwhelming references and allusions, is that the reader is being introduced to the character of Wyatt Guyon through the psychic trauma imposed on the family through the death of his mother, Camilla. This isn't to say it is the only thing occurring in the chapter. I don't mean to sound as though I'm entirely negating the significance of the references, because, in a novel such as this, the form is also the content. Just that, in my reading, this is at the core and is possibly the most essential element for a new reader to keep track of. This thematic core and the summary provided should be enough to make it through the chapter without too much difficulty. If you haven't read the chapter yet, I suggest doing so now and coming back to the video for further analysis. On the topic of references and how easy it is to get lost in them, it is recommended that readers check out the freely available annotations by Stephen Moore for a more in-depth catalogue of references than I could ever provide here. I am aware that it can be quite difficult and distracting for a reader to keep flicking back and forth between the annotations and the text, so what I wanted to provide here is an easy access to a synopsis of the chapter and an exploration of some key elements which stood out to me on this read-through. As always, this is a more condensed version of a greater exploration happening on my Substack and Patreon. More about those at the end of the video. In my writings on this chapter, I focused on two elements: the familial triangle and the mystical, and how the two are ultimately inextricable from one another. These two modes are obviously not the only way of looking at the chapter, but they are what struck me on this read-through. The familial triangle is self-evident. It represents the interaction between Gwion, Camilla and Wyatt, and the consequences of Camilla's disappearance from that system. The way I formulate the mystical spiritual in the novel is one of a system of historical decay. If we imagine a timeline, and we place pagan spirituality on the one end and the contemporary world on the other, it would plot a process of decay through the development of Christianity, through early Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, and whatever our kind of Christian worldview is in the present. This decay is evident in the way rituals and customs mask genuine connection to the mystical world. So, the pagan tradition is closest to the genuine magic in the world, and this connection is weakened the closer we get to the present. However, the present still contains some trace element of the real magic somewhere by means of ritual and custom. I'm aware I'm using pagan very broadly here, but as the novel provides no designation for all of the non-Christian spiritualities included in it, which can include the occult, pre-Christianity, Asian philosophy, Buddhism, indigenous Native American cultures, I'm just going to use pagan to delineate all that is not Christian, regardless of geography or ethnography. Both of these two elements come into play in the novel's opening paragraph. Even Camilla had enjoyed masquerades of the safe sort where the mask may be dropped at that critical moment it presumes itself as reality. But the procession up the foreign hill, bounded by cypress trees, impelled by the monotone chanting of the priest and retarded by hesitations at the 14 stations of the cross, not to speak of the funeral carriage in which she was riding, a white horse-drawn vehicle which resembled a Baroque confectionery stand, might have ruffled the shy countenance of her soul, if it had been discernible. Viewing this moment through the lens we have already described, the symbolism becomes quite clear. The masquerade, and the idea that there is some kind of meaningful difference between a safe masquerade and an unsafe masquerade, which Camilla has found herself on the wrong side of, is the key detail here. The grand, ornate, ritualistic nature of the Catholic funeral rite is presented as a somewhat silly performance that is almost too baroque for any normal person to partake in, but because it contains the essential truth of death, within it is the unsafe masquerade from which there is no possible escape. If one thinks about death, and the way in which death has been a central mystical experience of human life as long as it has existed on earth, the ritualism of the Catholic funeral appears as a masking of that experience. The body is placed in a box, then into a carriage, and then into a ground, and given a secondary position to the most famous death in history, the death of Christ, through those stations of the cross. At the same time, Camilla is being ripped from the familial triangle by this masquerade. Gwion is the only person from his family, or home, who sees the ceremony, and this is almost a second trauma for him. Not only has he seen her die, but he has seen her removed from the world in a quasi-magical ritual, in reverence to death. And the idea that if Camilla can be taken from the world through ritual, perhaps there is some magic deep in the world that can bring her back, haunts him, and drives him throughout the chapter and the novel. I don't think it's insignificant that, while discussing Wyatt's illness, Gwion tells his constituents, "When modern devices fail, it is our nature to reach back among the cures of our fathers. If those fail, there were fathers before them. We can reach back for centuries. Elsewhere, I have described the metaphorical movement of the characters in this chapter as a voyage and a counter-voyage. In typical Bildungsroman fashion, Wyatt is clearly moving forward on his journey. Gwion, however, is moving backwards through time in the pursuit of the truth that he thinks might be hidden there. Life, in its linear forward progression, is completely passing him by throughout the chapter, because he is so deeply concerned with defeating death and to reach a time before death entered the world, before accident, before magic, and before magic despaired to become religion. This oppositional movement is the central conflict that prevents Wyatt and Gwion from adequately recognising one another. Between the two of them is the traumatic absence of Camilla, and in their respective attempts to resolve this absence, they are driven into their own individual madnesses, which cannot interact. Wyatt, in this chapter, is not mad. In fact, he spends most of his time as a relatively normal child. After his father returns home and begins his drive towards esoteric knowledge, he begins to have doubts about the Christian worldview and takes up an interest in art, but this isn't yet madness. There are two key moments, after the death of Camilla and the return of Gwion, which shape Wyatt and his story going forward. The first being his encounter with Hieronymus Bosch's painting, The Seven Deadly Sins, which becomes, through his attempts at reproducing it, an object of immense significance in his life, and it's contrasted with his unfinished painting of Camilla, which points again to the trauma of absence and the way it stifles Wyatt's ability to genuinely express himself going forward. The second key moment is the killing of the wren, a moment which is imbued with intense symbolic and somewhat Oedipal significance, and which Stephen Moore dedicates a tremendous amount of time dissecting in the annotations and in his essay, The Recognitions, Myth, Magic and Metaphor. In a folkloric tale from the British Isles that Gaddis picked up from Robert Graves, a robin is released at New Year in order to kill its predecessor, the gold-crested wren, which represents the previous year. The robin in this story has killed its predecessor, its father figure, and, in the novel, the symbolism of Wyatt killing the wren, the symbolic father, has a striking resonance in the mind of the reader and in Gwion, who understands this metaphor. And this can be read into the chapter's conclusion, wherein Wyatt abandons his father and the life which had been planned for him by tradition, ultimately dooming Gwion to this completely secluded hermit lifestyle that leads him to madness and death. Perhaps the most memorable moment in the chapter, by virtue of its shocking content, is that of the ritualistic sacrifice of the ape, Heracles, which alleviates Wyatt's mysterious sickness. Had his father come in with Heracles, shaken him in his bed, and pounded the walls saying words he could not understand, and turned to drive the animal out before him and down the stairs, and then a faint cry from the carriage barn below. I explore this element and some of the other mystical events in the chapter over on my Patreon. The inspiration for this event comes from a recollection of a similar banishment ritual observed being carried out by the Garo people of Assam, recounted in James George Fraser's The Golden Bough. This scene is the culmination of Gwion's passage backwards from his Protestantism all the way to the primordial pagan magic. Gwion tells his parishioners as such, as we have already seen. When modern devices fail, it is our nature to reach back among the cures of our fathers. If those fail, there are fathers before them. We can reach back for centuries. Not only has he carried out the ancient ritual, but, to his eyes, he has succeeded in carrying out a genuine magical act. All of his research and devotion to study has culminated in the defeat of death and the saving of Wyatt, and yet it only creates a greater rift between father and son. Our two formulations, the family unit and the mystical journey, have encountered each other in an act of mysticism which has completely destroyed what is left of the familial relation. It may be interesting for the reader to consider a parallel between this scene and an earlier scene in which Gwion gives his last Christian sermon at Aunt May's funeral. There's a sense in which that was the end of one phase of Gwion's life, and the sacrifice of Heracles is the moment the fully mystical Gwion comes to the fore. As the chapter comes to its conclusion, Gwion, in a moment of striking lucidity, tells Wyatt, "Finish it, or she will be with you. Or she will be with you always," referring to the painting of Camilla which Wyatt can never bring himself to conclude. As we move forward throughout the recognitions, I think it's important to keep in mind that the men of the Gwion family, moving in their contrary motions, are driven by the absence of Camilla and their inability to resurrect her in a complete form. In fact, Wyatt is unable to create any complete original form as he is haunted by their imperfections, a horror that is not present in his reproductions. As we follow Wyatt throughout the rest of the novel, I hope I have come to clarify some of the forces which seem to be acting upon him and which push him into the actions he undertakes. I hope I have been able to elucidate how many of these actions are foreshadowed in what Wyatt undergoes in this chapter. And finally, I hope I have been able to bring clarity to your understanding of the chapter and to have drawn your eyes to some interesting ideas to track as you continue to read through this mammoth text. As always, I would like to remind you that this is only a small part of a much larger project being undertaken on both my Substack and my Patreon. For more in-depth analysis and for access to all of my research notes, please consider checking them out if you are interested. If you want to help my channel out, consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribe in order to keep up with all of my future uploads. Next time we will be taking a look at the much shorter second chapter, in which Wyatt hangs around the art community of Paris. I hope you will consider joining us, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.